and welcome to the Ask podcast. We are hoping today that you will attain some secret knowledge with us. This is a complex, befuddling world that we live in today, but hopefully we will unearth some treasures, some nuggets of knowledge with the expert advice of some of our teachers. Who are we? I am Jenni Summers. I'm Deputy Head of English at John Hampden Grammar School. My loves are Shakespeare, but also contemporary politics and anything historical. And here I have my co-host.
I am Mark Tell. I'm the Head of English at John Hampden, and I'm interested in lots of things, really. That's why I love that we're doing this podcast, because we work with so many very interesting members of staff who often go off and squirrel themselves away in little classrooms and say very, very interesting things to their classes. It's really nice to get them out of their classrooms and hear interesting things. So I'm very, very much looking forward to this.
Brilliant, excellent. And we also have three of our brightest minds from sixth form who will interrogate gently our guest of honour. Think of them as our gentle Spanish Inquisition. And of course, we're starting with James over here. Tell us about yourself, James.
Oh, thank you very much, Mom, for that introduction. Hi, I'm James. I am a sixth form here at John Hampden, and I'm going to study history and politics at university, so this is going to be a very interesting discussion for me.
Brilliant. And Teo?
Hi, I'm Teo. I'm currently in Year 12 and I study history at A level, so hopefully that will give me some insights into the discussion today. But I have a passion for science, and I also study chemistry, physics and math, so perhaps we can delve into some of that if it's not too scary for some of the other people.
I'm terrified already. This
big
is
show off.
Yes, I'm Dan, and I also study history and politics at A level in Year 12. And I also do debating, so I've got a keen interest in politics and that sort of thing.
And he loves English literature, which
Of
I
course,
teach him, which
of
he's
course.
forgotten about already.
And it's fair to say, Mark, just before you introduce our wonderful guest for today, that there's no hierarchy in the podcast room. Part of doing this podcast is to try and create a brave new world of people discussing ideas. So, talk over us. There's no staff-student distinction. I feel you have to go for it, get stuck in, and be no respecter of authority. Not that you are anyway, remotely, I know. But, yes, we're also creating a better world.
And that leaves me our inaugural guest of honour, Mr. Andy Sorden, Head of History. Such a prestigious guest to start with. And he's chosen Ernest Shackleton as his topic to tickle our fancy. So I think we should just jump right in here. I wanted to start bigger picture before we zoom in.
Sure.
So why Shackleton?
Right, so Ernest Shackleton, he's an Antarctic explorer who is remembered perhaps as having achieved, I would call it, the greatest feat of human survival in history. I would go so far as to call it that.
Bold.
And I think that one of the reasons why I was particularly interested in him, it kind of relates to my wider interest in history. For me, the reason why I love history is not just the analytical mindset that it gives you, but also the fact that it's just a treasure trove of stories that you can mine. And when I heard the story of Sir Ernest Shackleton, there's just so many parts of it that are quite inspirational and and inspiring, and they give us kind of all kinds of consolation in our everyday lives. Knowing that this poor soul and his 27 men had it so hard in Antarctica puts our own kind of everyday troubles into perspective.
Fantastic. I'm going to give it over to my esteemed colleagues to come up with some questions.
You were talking about consoling us in our day-to-day lives, and something that I'm always interested in history is what we can learn from all of the treasure trove of stories in our past. And so I was going to ask you, what can we learn from Ernest Shackleton? Because obviously he was a brilliant survivor. I think they spent 7 days on the open water, followed by another 5 days, and eventually none of his, or the 28 people on that expedition died. So what was it that made him so apt at being an explorer and keeping his men alive, and can we learn something from that in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in terms of what you can learn from Shackleton, he was the supreme man manager. So if you're interested in the nature of leadership, how to lead if not a successful mission, but how to salvage a mission, then there's so much to learn from him. It's probably worth us just summarising very shortly what his actual achievement was. So the goal of his expedition, which left England on the very day that World War I started, in August 1914, we could go into more of that later, its goal was to cross the Antarctic continent. So the the South Pole had already been reached by 2 other explorers. However, he found that his ship, the Endurance, got trapped in pack ice in the Antarctic Sea. The ship got essentially kind of strangled in this kind of vice-like grip by the ice, and it was frozen there on this sheet of ice, what's called an ice floe, for 9 months. So the men had to live in their ship for 9 months. Then the ship finally buckled under all the pressure and collapsed and sank. So they were left floating on ice and living essentially just in tents on camps on this ice, surrounded by open water, for 6 months. They then end up taking 3 of their lifeboats and they reach dry land. It was a place called Elephant Island. Shackleton then says to 22 of the men, "You stay here, I'll be back." And he tries to find, they are way off the edge of the map, way away from any kind of outpost of civilization. And he takes a lifeboat, which is 22 foot long, so a 7-meter lifeboat with 5 others. And they go on an 800-mile journey to the nearest island, which actually is inhabited, which is on South Georgia, where there are some whalers, some fishermen. They land, but they land along the wrong side of it. There's then a 36-hour march where they have to cross a mountain range to find the whalers. They've been gone nearly 2 years by this stage, and they say, right, okay, please, we need a ship. We've got 22 men. We need to get them to safety. So he ends up finally doing that, and it's nearly 2 years. By the time he arrives, he's at his 4th attempt, using his 4th ship, and he shunts through the ice and gets to the men on Elephant Island. It's been nearly 2 years since they originally departed. That was only achieved, to go back to your question, that was only achieved because the men had this relentless, almost supernatural belief in his leadership qualities and his ability to keep their morale high. I think was something that anyone can learn from, I think.
And that he'd come back. So if he leaves them there, they would have absolutely had to trust that he was going to do it and come back, and they seemed to, they did, they had faith in him. Right?
They were there on Elephant Island, which was a desolate little speck in the Antarctic Ocean. They were there for 4 months, and he said, "I'll be back, don't lose faith." The man, his second in charge, Frank Wild, who he left in charge, Frank Wild was put in charge of those men, and what he would do every day, and it might look a little bit foolish in retrospect, but every day he would say, "All right, pack up your sleeping bags. The boss is going to be back today. I just know it." And so every day, so when he came back after 4 months, he returned to find that every one of them had packed up their sleeping bag because they had kept their spirits to be kept high, and they were told by Frank Wild, "The boss will be back. The boss will get back." They all called him the boss, by the way. It was a nickname.
That's really fascinating. Because I was looking, and there's a quote from Ernest Shackleton. It says, "Optimism is true moral courage." And I was just, what gave him that optimism? And indeed all of his men, was it something that he was born with? Because I know he had a determination from an early age. I think he was in the Merchant Navy as a first mate from age 18. So he clearly had a lot of skill and a lot of passion. But is that something, the optimism, something he developed? Is it something we can learn from today? Is it what made him one of the greatest explorers in history?
That's such a great question. I think it was his natural disposition. It required him to be relentlessly optimistic. The other thing is as well, I think in terms of inculcating it in others, I think was most important to go back to his man management. There were characters amongst the 28 men who he thought could be difficult. Two of those men in particular, at least 2 of them, he took, when they took the lifeboat, 6 of them to try and get to the whaling station on South Georgia. He deliberately took 2 of the most difficult men with him, because he thought, if I leave you on Elephant Island for however many months, you're going to cause a bit of a disruption. There was one, the carpenter, McNeish, his name was. He had borderline incited mutiny. There was one stage where they were pulling along their sledges after they'd lost their ship. He said, "I'm not doing it anymore." And Shackleton, who knows what was said to him, but Shackleton pulled him aside, reminded him of his duties, and Shackleton made sure when the mission was in the balance, he made sure, right, you're coming with me. You're going to take this boat journey, 800 miles, 2 weeks in the open seas, the harshest seas on planet Earth. because he knew he couldn't kind of be left alone, and sow rebellion in the ranks.
It just sounds like what an amazing guy he was, and you can see why in America he seems to be so big, using the US Navy as a sign of great leadership in the congressional leadership textbook as well. And even in the UK, the University of Exeter have a course on Shackleton about how to lead. But it seems strange that after he got back from a lot of these expeditions, he seemed to have been forgotten, mainly overtaken by people like Scott and Amundsen. Why do you think that was?
Sorry, I'm going to stop saying that's a great question, because they're all great questions.
Let's take it for granted. The calibre of student we have.
That is a given. So the interesting thing about Shackleton's reputation is when Shackleton returned and news of his heroic feats reached England in the middle of World War One, and the general consensus in Britain was, where on earth have you been? We've been fighting a war these last 2 years. So when Shackleton wrote about his expedition, he did a book about it called South. He was very consciously fighting off this suspicion that existed in Britain that you've shirked your duties in World War One. He was very clear to say, when he dedicated the book, he said, this book is dedicated to all my colleagues who perished on the white warfare of the South and on the fields of Flanders. So he was trying to say, we were doing a mission for Britain, which was as much supportive of our national honour as yours. But the point is, during World War One, people didn't want a survival story. And during World War One, in fact, the far more famous and celebrated polar hero was the hero who's the great example of heroic death, which is Scott of the Antarctic. Scott reached the South Pole in 1912. He died on the way back. And interestingly, what Britain needed in World War One, with hundreds of thousands of deaths of casualties, Britain almost psychologically, it needed a hero that gave them a sense that, death can have meaning. And Scott provided that. And Shackleton didn't. And it's only after World War One that Shackleton's reputation, I think, has improved. News of his return came 2 days before the Battle of Jutland in 1916. So it was 2 days. It was off the news. By contrast, Scott of the Antarctic's expedition footage was shown to soldiers. 100,000 soldiers saw footage of Scott's expedition, because at that time soldiers needed a reason, like, why are all our mates are dying in the trenches? What's the point of it all? And Scott gave an example. This could be another podcast, but Scott gave an example of how to meet your maker and how to meet death in a way that the country thought was noble and dignified. Shackleton's story of heroic survival didn't match what Britain needed in World War One, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
Well, I suppose one interesting question is, obviously in the modern day we can sort of imagine large Antarctic bases and these sort of modern appliances that would help us through such a difficult time, whereas back then, 1910 to sort of 1920, these things simply didn't exist. So could you perhaps elaborate on what some of the sort of conditions they would have been experiencing would have been?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ship that they sailed was called the Endurance, and it was especially kitted out because essentially they knew that it would have to kind of shunt through the pack ice. So it had a special design. It was made of a type of wood which was denser than iron to try and make it shunt through the pack ice. Still couldn't do the job. What the men did find, therefore, they had to then live on the ship for 9 months. Bear in mind they were within the Antarctic Circle. Bear in mind that meant that they had a 3-month period where it was pitch black, where they didn't see the sun. So in Antarctica, obviously the Antarctic winter, it's dark 24 hours a day, and then in Antarctic summer it's light 24 hours a day. There are even stories. There was a Belgian expedition in 1899 where the men, from being exposed to 24 hours of darkness for months at a time, really did seem to exhibit signs of insanity. They really were. It was fraying on them mentally. So the mental toil on them, I think, was fairly severe. The other thing is, once the ship sank, they were then on tents, and these tents weren't on stable ice. The ice floe they were on was perhaps 6 feet deep. So they were then in tents, and they were lying at night either on bare ice, or they'd just have like a slab of timber that they would lie on. And there was one instance where the ice floe collapsed under them, and a number of the men were just immediately plunged into sub-zero water. And there's a moment where Shackleton saves one of his men's life. They see that the ice floe is cracking, and they said one of his men said he looked like a full-grown Moses as he was plunged in his sleeping bag into the water. And Shackleton, in an instant, he would have died very quickly of hypothermia, then kind of whisked him out. That same man then complained after the boss had saved his life. He then complained about the fact he lost his tobacco when it happened. But even so, I think they then, perhaps worth saying, once they were on Elephant Island, the 22 men who actually found land, it was a really tough business finding the food they needed. So they had to essentially, any time, you feel sorry for them, but any time they got near a seal or a penguin, that was killed. Sometimes they had to ration their ammunition, so sometimes that would be a shot in the head, sometimes kind of bludgeoned, not especially pleasant. So getting those food supplies, they were basically just eating seal and penguin. So yeah, but perhaps that goes some way to saying some of the difficulties.
What kind of temperatures would they have been experiencing? Because there are some mornings, even still, it feels a bit uncomfortable to go to the car at 6:30 or something. Yeah, and you find out it's maybe a couple of degrees above zero or something. Yeah. What are we talking about?
You're talking about sort of minus 30 degrees Celsius fairly regularly. So, for example, when the men were travelling by I was about to call it a ship, but when they were travelling by boat, that 7-metre boat, they had to take it in turns to chip ice off the boat because it was in danger of going under because of the weight of the ice. So it was pretty relentless. And by the way, it could be even worse if temperatures did get to near 0 degrees Celsius. That could be just as unpleasant because you would sleep in your tent, and during the night the snow under you would melt, and you would wake up in a kind of melted mush underneath you. And so actually a lot of the time it was easier and preferable if it was really cold, because at least you then had a kind of a hard surface under you.
You'd wake up at 0 saying, "Wow, that was a warm night. That was uncomfortably warm. Look, some of the ice has melted."
Yeah, exactly.
Was it a case of, sorry if this is an ignorant question, was it a case of frostbite? Did people get frostbite? Did they lose bits of limbs or anything?
Yeah, I think by this time there was very good knowledge of the kind of diet the men needed and what they needed to keep themselves warm. Certainly, frostbite was a very regular occurrence, and these men had to keep it in very close proximity. There are times in which they are sleeping essentially just in one big bundle, in one big tent. On Elephant Island, they construct like one big tent for themselves, which they're all just bundled together in. So they had to be quite ingenious in terms of preserving body warmth. In terms of, but fortunately, I think it's testament to his leadership skills. There weren't any lasting injuries that I know of that persevered after the expedition.
That's amazing. Absolutely brilliant.
Is there a sense that one of the things that really marks Shackleton out is his absolute determination not to lose the lives of the men he was responsible for? Was there an instance where, after he and Scott had a first mission, hadn't they? It's the Discovery mission. They become rivals. He goes back and he gets closer than anybody to the South Pole. This is even before Amundsen eventually does it. He gets closer than anybody. But am I right in saying he makes a decision, even though there's something like 97 miles away, that they turn back because he doesn't think he has enough supplies to protect all of them? And at the time when no one had conquered the South Pole, that's a huge decision. Does that show the difference between him and Scott, or is that too bold? That fundamentally he was looking out for the people there?
I think that it's definitely valid to make that comparison. Yeah, so I think certainly, whereas Scott embodied heroic death, Shackleton embodied heroic survival. And when he made that decision to turn back 97 miles from the South Pole, he would have conquered it, but would he have got his men back? He wasn't sure. And it was a letter that he wrote to his wife where he said, "I thought you would have preferred a live donkey than a dead lion," is what he said to his wife. And I think maybe that's partly why Shackleton resonates with us more today, because whereas Scott, Scott, part of the reason that his death is mythologized is because it's his own diaries. So Scott kept diaries that were found clung to him when his body was found near the South Pole. And one of the final things he wrote was a message to the public. And he said, "Had we lived, we would have had a tale to tell which would have stirred the soul of every Englishman. As it is, our dead bodies must tell the tale." Mm-hmm. And to Edwardian England, they loved it, because he was saying, "I died, and in doing so, I showed that Englishmen can endure hardships just as well as any other." Perhaps today that resonates with us slightly less well than a leader who does an absolutely incredible amount to ensure the life of his men, rather than sacrificing them to an ideal or an abstract goal.
And if Shackleton and his team had died, would we have actually known anything about the expedition at all? Because they were in such a remote part of the world.
Probably not. When their ship was trapped, when it finally sank, they were 1,200 miles from land. There was no prospect of salvation from anyone else. They had a very rudimentary early form of radio, but it didn't, as it turned out, they tried, whilst the ship was still there, they tried tying it up the mast and doing all sorts of things with the aerial to try and extend its range, and failed entirely. So it would have simply been one of those mysteries. Whatever happens to Shackleton's expedition, no one would know. It's probably worth saying at this point, when he does arrive, after that 800-mile boat journey, crosses the mountain range on South Georgia, he had met the head of the whaling station 2 years before, but when he arrives, the head of the whaling station doesn't recognise him, because his skin had been so darkened by exposure, by frostbite, by sheer kind of grubbiness. There are stories that some of the children on that whaling station, they thought they looked like some kind of monsters emerging from the ocean when they saw them, because all of their clothes had kind of rotten away, the stitches had rotted away.
Not great for the skincare regime.
It's not great for the skincare regime.
Antarctic exploration, turns out.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's really interesting about the expedition is when Shackleton arrived, he said to the whaler, he said, so what happened? Who won the war? That war that started 2 years ago. And the whaler said to him, "Haven't you heard? The whole world's gone mad. Europe is destroying itself." And so there's another thing there, I think, that really appeals about Shackleton to me, is he's off trying to, for the spirit of the adventure, and in order to test humankind's, I should say, in order to test humankind's limits, he's decided to go on this really heroic expedition. But at the same time, the rug of the world that he was part of has been pulled away from him whilst he's been there.
Is that another casualty of the First World War? So many casualties, but that golden age of Antarctic exploration, or even something more profound, ends with the First World War. That sense of, I don't know, maybe that's going too far, but that feels like a big watershed, doesn't it?
Absolutely, I'm very glad to be having this conversation among such sensitive English teachers as well that can appreciate this. It was epoch defining, really. He kind of bestrides kind of two different epochs, and what was really interesting is the fact that this, even by 1920, all of these explorers looking back, they knew this time was gone. By the 1920s, you want to reach Antarctica? Just take a plane. So whereas these men, they were doing it through kind of crushing their ship through the seas, through agonizing, what they call like man-hauling. So the idea is that they would kind of plod agonizingly, like with men hauling those sledges. And so in that sense, it was something there was something very idealistic about the journey, which was also destroyed not just by World War One, but also the advent of modern technology. Scott, by the way, he did have some kind of motorised tractors that he intended to use in the South Pole, but they were too unwieldy, too unreliable. They broke down. But by the 1920s, it's clear that technology means that the romance and the spirit of this kind of adventure just isn't necessary anymore. And that in itself is really interesting to me.
I wonder, do you think the advent of technology has taken away our drive to explore? Because I read something else that Shackleton said, and he said the only failure is not to explore at all. And I felt almost guilty, just sort of sat there with my little snack and my iPad, just not having really done any proper exploration in my life. And I'm sure no one here has been to the Antarctic, although I know actually Miss Tremelling has, which is quite impressive.
What do you think as young people? We've got 3 students here. I'm interested in this too. This question really occurred to me. Has life changed? Are we not as... All the names of the ships, Discovery, Terra Nova, Endurance, are they qualities that we've lost? Or do you as young people, what's the next frontier for you in terms of human exploration?
Space, surely, is it not? Because, while technology's destroyed the exploring our own planet to some extent, although there is still sort of ecosystems that are being explored and things we don't even know about the oceans, space is clearly sort of the most exciting thing of the 21st century. This idea that, having done sort of prior missions to the moon, that we've gone there and come back and not really been there since, we'll now sort of be looking forward to go to Mars and settle and colonise.
But are we? Because are you excited about it? Because I just get a feeling that spirit of Apollo, it's almost like you have the Antarctic exploration period, you have the Apollo period, the space race period, and it's a similar sort of reaching out and boundaries and frontiers. And I don't get the feeling that our year 7s, for example, that they wake up in the middle of the night and go, I might be the first person on Jupiter or Mars. No. Or have we lost that sense of actually pushing the boundaries?
Does SpaceX count? I think Elon Musk is viewed as a very kind of glamorous kind of entrepreneur, and he's very much views himself perhaps as taking on the mantle of pushing the boundaries of exploration. What do we think?
Well, I think the fact that sort of year 7s, all the year 7s don't wake up and think, I could do this and that. I don't think that particularly says much, because obviously it wasn't the entire population of England who was on the Shackleton voyage. It was Shackleton and his men. It's the select few who are courageous enough to do such a thing. So the fact that it's limited, I think, is actually more of an argument that it's special, that it's unique, than it is that it's dying out.
Although I suppose it also says something about how society has changed, because obviously I know that as we say, there probably aren't many people who are interested in even exploring our planet when there are so many areas still undiscovered, and there are modern explorers. You just probably haven't heard of any of them because we're just not interested in exploring our own planet anymore. I wonder if we've almost lost interest in planet Earth and now we've moved on to space, and are we losing interest in space? I think something's changed. And also, as you were saying about the danger of exploring, we've kind of lost that with the advent of technology, and I wonder if we've always wanted some sense of danger to interest us.
I think, and perhaps this is something that I haven't quite been able to kind of pin down, there's something about the spirit of exploration here. They view almost the suffering and the trials and tribulations, it's worth something. And so Shackleton, when he wrote South, he said, when we stumbled onto South Georgia and we had survived that boat journey, he said, we had lost everything, but we were rich in memories, and we had reached the naked soul of man. There was this idea that through that suffering, they had reached something kind of more profound about human experience. And it's worth saying for a lot of these Antarctic explorers, they were very funny. They're an interesting bunch. Like, who decides, I've had enough of human civilization, I want to go to the most barren and desolate place on Earth? For many of them, it's like, I think there was something quite appealing about Antarctica. In Antarctica, and maybe this is true of exploration more generally, it gives you very simple, clear aims. It's like what Sir Edmund Hillary said of Everest. He said, "Why does a man climb Everest? Because it's there." It gives us something to do. It's a way of measuring our energies. But I'm not sure if I say all this, of course, as someone who likes being warm and comfortable as well. So.
I wonder if now we sort of wonder what the point of exploring it was, because when they set out to explore Antarctica, they didn't really have a purpose or an aim apart from just doing it for the
It's
sake of
there.
it, reaching the South Pole or crossing Antarctica. That was their only real purpose. Like, I found it ironic when you said they were eating seals and penguins, because I think on an expedition now you're probably studying the animals instead of eating them. And I just thought that was slightly ironic, because they didn't really have that purpose, or they weren't really studying anything. And I wonder if now we assess more whether it's worth going through a level of suffering. We try and assess what we attain. And I think similar things have happened with the war, because I personally wouldn't have gone to fight in World War One were it an option now, because I think we probably assess the benefits of doing something, and I wonder if that's something else that's changed in society.
Yeah, it's certainly with Scott's expedition. Scott's view, one of the reasons that his reputation was very strong despite his death, was this idea that it had a very strong scientific focus. There was a journey to collect emperor penguin eggs for scientific study, which is rightly remembered as the worst journey in the world. There was a book written about it by Apsley Cherry Garrard called just that. And also, by the way, Scott, when he was found frozen dead in his tent, his sledge had 14 kilograms of geological specimens in it. Like, he was still lugging around rocks, being like, "We're going to get these back to the lab, and we're gonna study these." So I think they did have some of that. I don't know if we call it like a utilitarian purpose, because they told themselves they were pushing the boundaries of scientific understanding. But I think if the men were honest, that wasn't why a lot of them were doing it.
To bring it back to us, I'm just thinking, we use words like barren and isolation, obviously. Pandemic, we can't really escape it. I'm just wondering, not in an exploration kind of way, can we bring some of the lessons from Scott into our lives in this situation? I know we're starting to come out of lockdown now, but there's still a lot of challenges, so I'm just wondering where the parallels might lie there.
Certainly with Shackleton, those 22 men, what seems to have kept them from killing each other whilst they were waiting for rescue for 4 months, it's quite simple. Do you know what they said the most important thing was that kept them sane? It was a banjo. One of them had a banjo, which he played, and they all had a great time singing songs with one another. They were literally experiencing the most intense isolation period in history, just 4 months in a tent with 21 other people. And perhaps their relentless good cheer is something that we can kind of aspire to as well with all of our own kind of difficulties.
Brilliant. That was such a fascinating conversation. I've learned an incredible amount from you. So you're brilliantly eloquent with loads of fascinating facts that I hope people take away and can take away into their own lives. And thank you to my lovely sixth formers as well. I'm just astounded at the level of your questioning, and I'm really hoping that other people have heard this and think, wow, goodness me, what's some boys that we've got in here, and have maybe encouraged other people to go on and have these explorations for themselves, talking through these kind of ideas, perhaps learning some more about Shackleton, watching some videos about him. I'm hoping that will be the case.
I would absolutely agree. Also, so we get some regular listeners to this podcast and make this a regular thing. I think the quality of discussion is one thing, but also people like prizes. And so in each episode, we're going to seed a little clue. And anyone who is a multiple listener, it'll be at different points in the episode. So you won't always be at the end like this, but sometimes it'll be somewhere in an episode. We'll have a different clue. You've got to put the clues together, and there is some kind of solution or puzzle to work out. All I will say is that today's clue, it'll be a single word each time. Today's clue is Dickens. Dickens is today's clue. Episode 1,
Can
Dickens.
we play along?
Cryptic.
I was going to say,
I
So
don't
we have to be
know.
regular listeners of the podcast.
Okay, regular listeners.
Wonderful.
And with that in mind, the idea of trying to spread the word, if you have enjoyed this and you'd like to get involved, obviously we'd love it if you could review us on wherever you're listening to this podcast. It would be great if you could follow us at JHGS English on Twitter. Would be absolutely fantastic. It's been really lovely.
And JHGS history.
I nearly got in trouble there. I wouldn't want to forget that. Yeah, so I really hope that everybody's enjoyed today being with the Ask podcast. I hope you have attained some secret knowledge. So it only leaves us now to say farewell and see you again very soon.
Absolutely. Bon voyage.
Hurrah.